Hi there, welcome to the Becker's Healthcare Women's Leadership Forum. Before the program begins, we'd like to take this time to recognize our sponsor for this event, Change Healthcare. Change Healthcare's vision is to accelerate the transformation of the healthcare system through the power of the Change Healthcare platform. Change Healthcare focuses on 3 outcomes. 1, making the healthcare experience as positive as possible for everyone. 2, helping our customers make payments and helping them get paid quickly and correctly. And 3, helping our customers navigate the changing healthcare landscape more easily and more effectively. Diversity and inclusion is at the forefront of Change Healthcare's mission, and we are thrilled they could support this event. Thank you, Change Healthcare. We hope you enjoy today's program. Good afternoon. Thank you for being part of the Becker's Healthcare Women's Leadership Virtual Forum. Time is our most precious commodity, and we're setting out today under the notion that there is simply no more time to waste when it comes to the inclusion, advancement, and equitable treatment of women. Gender inequities have long persisted in institutions and in society, but the coronavirus pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement have made them all but impossible to ignore. So much work remains to further professional, civic, social, and economic equity for women. This is why in 1 hour, you will hear 7 C-level female leaders get to the heart of the matter on the issues, ideas, and beliefs that matter most to them. There is something remarkable about powerful women coming together to speak candidly and directly about bright ideas, personal experiences, pitfalls, missteps, and so much more. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so we'll move briskly. Let me now invite our panelists to join me on screen and provide a wave as I introduce them to you. Fantastic. We have Lynette Chappell-Williams here with us today. Lynette is Chief Diversity Officer for Penn State Health and Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion and instructor at Penn State College of Medicine in Hershey, Pennsylvania. It's a pleasure to have Nikki Sumter with us. Nikki is Chief Human Resources Officer of 6 Hospital Atlantic Health System based in Morristown, New Jersey. Please welcome Karen Murphy. Karen is Executive Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer of Geisinger and Founding Director of the Steele Institute for Healthcare Innovation at Geisinger. Geisinger is a physician-led system with 13 hospital campuses based in Danville, Pennsylvania. Roxana Gepster is with us. Roxana is President and CEO of WellSpan Health, an 8-hospital system based in New York, Pennsylvania. We're excited to welcome Sue Murphy. Sue is Chief Experience Officer of UChicago Medicine, an integrated academic and community health system. We have Dr. Liz Mort. Liz is a Senior Vice President of Quality and Safety for Mass General Hospital in Boston and Mass General Physicians Organization, which is the largest multi-specialty medical group in New England. And last but not least, Angela Shippey. Angela is Senior Vice President and Chief Medical and Quality Officer for Memorial Hermann Health System, a 17-hospital system based in Houston. Panelists, welcome. Thank you very much for being part of this important virtual event. I am so grateful to serve as your moderator today, and I'm really looking forward to a dynamic discussion. Lynette, I'm going to ask you to stay with me as my first interview. We'll hear from each panelist one-on-one within the next hour, and then we're going to conclude the event together with one final question as a group. But Lynette, I'd love to hear your insights on matters pertaining to HR and talent. And specifically, a 2019 study from Lean In and McKinsey found women of color are more likely than their white counterparts to be interrupted and spoken over in work settings. 1/3 of women of color also reported that others have taken credit for their ideas at some point. For managers and leaders who are joining us today, what are some active measures they can take in meetings and other professional exchanges in the workplace to fight and combat those kinds of transgressions?
So thank you. That is such an important question. And I will say that in that study, they also found that about 40% of Black and Latinx women reported being interrupted and spoken over, and about 18% of them actually felt invisible and excluded. You feel so disrespected when someone talks over you. So some of the things that managers can do, the first thing is to be proactive. if managers establish meeting ground rules in the very beginning so that everyone understands how to interact with each person, including asking that everyone plan on contributing to the discussion. And that way, those who tend to be a little more upfront or and sort of ambitious, I'll say, in terms of trying to talk, understand that their colleagues will be talking as well. The other thing is that when someone does interrupt, the manager should call that out. So for example, say, so-and-so, I do believe that this individual is trying to complete her statement, so let's let her finish. And then it would be helpful to talk to the individual who has interrupted in private after the meeting to stress how important it is for individuals to be able to contribute. That's how, as an organization, we can all be advancing in terms of the things that we're trying to accomplish. If the manager doesn't take action, and if you are left on your own to address the behavior, it's important to stop the behavior. And don't start that off with apologizing. As women, we have a tendency to say, I'm really sorry, but, so exclude that part and just call the person out in a respectful way and indicate, I was talking, I know that you've got something important to say, but what I'm saying is important as well. So I'd like to finish my thought and then you can add to that. So that's the approach in terms of when someone is talking over. When an individual takes credit for your work, it's important not to let the emotions to take over, to make sure you put those in check. So if it takes place in a meeting, commend the person for the idea, and then advise them that that was the same thing that you came up with at an earlier time. And so you're glad that you're both in agreement. And so now let's talk about how we can sort of expand on the idea that you developed the day before. So I think it's important to let that individual know that you recognize that that was something that you had proposed before.
Excellent advice, Lynette. I appreciate this so much. So set ground rules. If you're the team, if you're the leader leading a meeting, set ground rules from the very beginning, set expectations around contributions to that meeting so people perhaps don't feel impetus to interrupt one another, and I only have so much time, so it can drive perhaps some poor behavior in that way. And then if you are the person who was cut off or interrupted, identifying it and just, like you said, not apologizing, not saying, I'm sorry, but I was speaking, but just saying, excuse me, and calling some attention to what happened. Love also your advice for if someone takes your idea. I'm curious if this has ever happened to you, if some of your advice stems from a firsthand experience.
Absolutely. I think that we have all experienced that at some point. And so that's something that has worked for me. And in that way, you maintain those relationships with people because you don't want to respond in such a way that they think of you in a different style. There's a number of names that people sort of use when an individual comes across as being really aggressive. So I think that if we do it in a respectful way so that we all feel valued, that's what helps.
Absolutely. And then we have a bit more time, Lynette, together, and I wanted to talk about something too that's really important for women of color as well, and that's the emotional tax they can feel at work, which is this subtle feeling that's not always visible, but they feel as though they are on guard. They are prepared for unfair treatment, bias, prejudice, and it can really have an effect on their well-being, their ability to be innovative and creative. It perhaps contributes to their wanting to leave the company. As a leader who is with us today, what is the most important thing for people to keep in mind about this emotional tax and either deal with that themselves or look out for their colleagues who might be experiencing the same?
So it's interesting because Catalyst actually found that 60% of both men and women of color experience this emotional tax. And as you shared, it can create huge, not only emotional issues, but it can actually start impacting individuals physically as well. And there's a tendency for individuals to just tolerate it. But I would give the advice of not doing that because in the long term impact your career because you won't be as upfront in terms of ideas that you might have. So I think sitting down with your manager or supervisor to explain that this is something that is impacting your ability to be productive and to map out a strategy for how to address it. And then enlisting those that you see as allies or colleagues to say, this is what you can do in terms of helping me to address this. It's important not to try to be the strong one in these kinds of situations, but to acknowledge that this is something that you're dealing with just because of your aspect of difference. And so you need others in terms of supporting you so that you can be 100% in terms of your effort.
Lynette, thank you so much for your insight to both of those questions. I'm going to loop back with you toward the end of the hour here, but now let me ask Nikki to join me. Hi, Nikki.
Hello. How are you, Molly?
I'm doing well. Thanks for being here. Nikki, I want to hear from you how you distinguish needle-moving, successful diversity efforts from window dressing. And I think when it comes down to it, there's been quite a bit of some performative gestures over the past several months, some virtue signaling and statements rooted from really nice PR firms that are put out by corporations and businesses. And I'm curious to get your perspective on what are some tells that you see that an effort is really rooted in reality and designed for results, opposed to those more performative efforts.
I think you bring a really great point. I think we've seen a lot of signaling over the last few months, and I think it's important for us to recognize that there continues to be a need to have real action and outcomes. So when I think about that, I think one of the most important things that we can do as healthcare professionals is really to look at social determinants of health and really begin to make some strides in that regard. Metrics are always going to be important in that space, and making sure that we close the gaps that continue to plague many communities.
So if you're in healthcare and you're a leader in healthcare, continuing to look back at social determinants of health, what progress are we making? Can we point to progress made? Where should our next focus be?
Absolutely.
That's great advice. And then Nikki, talking about diversity inclusion efforts, what in your mind are 3 things that are likely to determine whether those efforts succeed or fail?
So I believe there are probably 3 things that are really closely woven together: metrics, outcomes, and engagement. And I'll start with metrics. Every successful diversity program should have a set of metrics that really guides the work. And from that, we want to make sure that we're not only being diverse when we look at those metrics, but we're also being inclusive. The outcome of inclusion is engagement. And so making sure that the folks that are around us are engaged in the progress of the work. When we have a clear set of metrics, we have that engagement, we get better outcomes. And so we know that through really successful diversity programs that we've all seen around the country, that when we have those 3 factors in place, that we can really make a big difference in the way that we either care for communities or provide services, from whatever we do, from whatever vantage point we sit.
So metrics, outcomes, and engagement.
Yes.
3 most critical determinants of whether an effort succeeds or fails.
Absolutely.
Of those 3, is there one that is most often misfired, that companies and organizations are most likely to misinterpret or get wrong?
I think it's inclusion. I think when folks are not, Lynette brought up some really great points about making sure that everyone's voice is heard. But when people are not heard, it's hard for them to feel engaged, right? And if I'm not heard, then I may not be included either. So we've got to figure out, how do we listen differently? I love the question that you posed to Lynette, because it really is about how do we listen to people before we respond, right? So I don't think we want to lose that nuance around really being inclusive in our environments and making sure that we make sure that everyone is engaged.
Mm-hmm. Excellent guidance. Nikki, thank you so much for your insights.
You're welcome.
Karen, I'm going to turn to you. We're going to talk about women at the negotiation table a bit. You know, people tend to perceive women are more risk averse than men. Can this assumption about women actually benefit them at the negotiation table?
Molly, that's a very good question. I think there are many stereotypes and there are many assumptions that are made in the workplace from women leadership. And I have found, quite frankly, women to be less risk averse than perhaps our counterparts. I think it's important, we talked about before, setting ground rules when you are negotiating. And I think whoever you're negotiating with should be able to figure out pretty quickly that you actually are not risk averse. And I think it is key for women to be authentic in those negotiations. And, you know, I hate to feed into stereotypes to say, you know, it's an advantage or a disadvantage. So I'm not going to go there. I'm going to say that to be an effective negotiator, you use your negotiation skills and your strength. And I find women to be very fewer risk averse.
Excellent. I appreciate you avoiding the categorization and stereotyping. Studies have shown, so this isn't so much the assumptions about women, but studies have shown that people are more likely to prioritize their mentors depending on how likable they are. They'll look for people who are kind of like positive cheerleaders, but not necessarily pay great attention to their expertise. And I'm curious, as a leader, how you redirect your attention and your team's attention from personality, away from personality, to skills, competence, and expertise.
So this is a big topic that I have the privilege of leading early career, mid-career women. And we tend to sometimes be pleasers and to worry about likability and really emphasize that in the workplace, you know, I always say it's not miscongeniality, right? You're going to be assessed on how effective you are. And I think the likability factor of women particularly is always challenging in the workplace. And I'd like to say that that is not the case, but I really do believe it is much more on women than it is on men. So I think it's really important that Lynette had referred to, there is no need to apologize before you state a fact. There is no need to apologize that or to even call out the fact that you feel strongly about an opinion. And I'm always focusing our team on really about assessing the effectiveness of the work as opposed to worrying about whether you're liked or not. Because I think at the end of the day, if you worry too much about likability, you're not going to end up being terribly effective.
And is that rest on the idea that the energy you spend thinking about how likable you are is just going to be wasted and detracted from what you're working on and your work and creativity and things like that?
I think it is. And I think also, Molly, if you're adapting another personality or you're trying to develop traits that you read in a book that are what you're supposed to be, at the end of the day, that lack of authenticity certainly comes out very clearly. And I think we have to be our authentic self when we're in the workplace and really strive for that effectiveness and not think about the likability factor. And I think one last thing that I would say on this is also women have to encourage other women. We're not great at that. And I think that's something that in terms of sharing observations with women when they presented themselves in a very effective way, I think encouraging women to really stand up and be effective is really important. And I think it means a lot to women to hear that from other women.
That's excellent advice. And Karen, you specifically mentioned kind of building on Lynette's comments about not apologizing for stating a fact, not apologizing when you have a strong opinion. Are there any other cues that you really encourage the women you mentor who are early in their careers to pay attention to, just to differentiate that likability doesn't have to come at the expense of softening your expertise or not showing up and kind of hiding your competence, if you will?
Yes, so I encourage those that I mentor, I encourage them to stand up and to actually be counted, not to sit around the side of the room, but sit at the table. And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to speak out. You know, if you get the first look that maybe is not very supportive, then push through that and establish your own credibility. And I think that's really important for women to do.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, Karen, thank you so much for your insights today. Women are lucky to have a mentor like you. I'm going to ask Roxana to join me now. Hi, Roxana.
Hello, Molly.
So Roxana, I want to get your perspective on how gender can show up in the boardroom. Female directors are generally in the minority on boards, and even their appointments can distract or attract outsized attention than the appointment of their counterparts. That's one way. I know that gender can have a difference in the boardroom, but I'm curious to hear from you and what you've noticed.
Yeah, I think, you know, board director experiences are as varied as the organizations that they govern. And so whenever you're thinking about being a candidate for a board or whenever you're joining a board, it's so important to make sure that you check out that board and that organization to understand how they approach governance and what the diversity of that board is. And I also think it's incumbent on women to just be really cautious about playing into those gender stereotypes. And you've heard that from a few of the panelists today, including Karen and Lynette. So one of the things that I learned actually from one of my speaking coaches was how people who are in theater take the stage, right? And so to be able to just take the stage, own your ideas, not be apologetic for those, and fully participate in the conversation with confidence. And I think sometimes when people are earlier in their careers, as Karen just mentioned, that might be a little bit, may make you feel a little more uneasy or a little harder to do. But I think as you gain confidence and experience, you can feel, you know, good about doing that. So that's one of the things. I think also, you know, as I mentioned, not playing into gender stereotypes during the meeting. So being very careful to not be too deferential to male colleagues and to really try and treat people as similarly as possible on the board as you're going through conversations.
Excellent. So being aware of the stereotypes that might exist about women in the boardrooms, but not perpetuating them, not assuming that's going to be your reality. I think that's really helpful to hear. And, you know, speaking of boardrooms, I'm going to ask you the same question I posed to Karen about negotiations that could occur in the boardroom or even other executive level settings. And people tend to perceive women as more risk averse, which Karen, you know, very strongly disagreed with in her experience. I'm curious what you've seen and whether this assumption has been something that actually worked to your advantage or not.
I would agree with Karen. I don't see women as being necessarily risk averse. I do think sometimes we're actually known to be more collaborative and more supportive of others. And I often think in negotiation that helps us really understand people's motivations and the why during negotiations, which is really important. So we may be better at listening and understanding and thinking through and looking for that win-win during negotiations, which I think is so important because after all, if we don't understand the underlying motivations and agenda and we can't find the win-win, often our negotiations aren't very successful. And I actually think women have an edge in that regard sometimes because of the approach that we take to collaboration.
Has there been one negotiation experience or lesson you learned along the way that you would feel comfortable imparting with those with us today?
Yeah, I've had actually quite a bit of experience in my past career with union negotiations. And I remember a negotiation that I was part of where we literally got down to the last day and the deal we ended up striking was completely different than the deal that we saw at the beginning of the negotiations. And I think a big part of that was really working hard to understand that underlying why, and not assuming that the demands that are placed on the table during the first part of the negotiation tell the whole story. And so often you do take a winding path sometimes in negotiations to get to the final product. But I thought it was a really instructive negotiation that particular time about really truly understanding the underlying motivation.
Absolutely. And you know, this is a question we're going to pose with the whole group at the conclusion of this event, Roxana, but I'm hoping to get a bit more detail from you, and that's about how you strive to set the tone about gender equity on your teams. I want to learn what's most important to you at the end of the hour when you're doing that, but I think hopefully now you can just share a bit more about instructively how you do that. What actions do you take? What steps do you take? What do you keep an eye out for? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. Yeah, I think what's really important, and this has been written about quite a bit in the literature too, is that often for women, having a sponsor at work can be very helpful. And so I look to sponsor women in my own organization, and I've had that same sponsorship myself as I've moved through my career. It's been extremely helpful. So mentorship is great as well, but actually someone who's willing to put themselves out for you and help you advance your career can be really, really important for women. And so I do look for that in my current role, and I do specifically identify talented and high potential women that we can move into those sponsorship roles with others in our organization.
And before we wrap up, Roxana, I think this is a question many young women and people early in their careers face, men or women. But how do you find a sponsor? Is it you sit down and you ask them formally, will you commit to this with me? I'm really interested in learning from you. Do you have any tips on how that conversation can be started and had?
That is a great question. So I've had it happen both ways for me, where someone has actually said, you know, I see something in you that I'd like to develop, and I'd like to work more closely with you in a sponsorship role. And then I've also asked people to be sponsored, and I've had people ask me. So I think it could be either way.
Excellent. Well, Roxana, thank you so much for your insights. I'm going to turn to your colleague, Sue Murphy. Sue, if you'll join me on screen. Hi, Sue.
Hi.
So, Sue, I wanted to get your take on some of the things your colleagues have been speaking about, and that's how gender has shown up in the boardroom for you, and if there's been any ways your experience as a woman has differed from that of your counterparts, that your colleagues could be mindful of with us today. And then I also want to hear about your thoughts on the likability question. Karen had shared some thoughts there about people prioritizing personality and likability at the expense or more than expertise and competence. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that too. But let's talk first about the boardroom.
Great. Well, thank you. And I just want to acknowledge being with all of my colleagues today and already learning so much myself from them as we continue to explore what we can do to continue the growth in the real passion of what we do with what we do around our gender. So as far as the boardroom is concerned, you know, I really think it's really about how you show up. And so if you come into the room with confidence, you're competent, and you really have a clear direction of how you want to portray yourself, and try to almost have that feeling of what I need to do to be part of the right voice around the table, then I think even if the gender is apparent, you really do overcome that by who you're being. And so I truly believe that coaching other women who I've had the pleasure to work with in my career, and even coaching myself, I really have to remember how I show up is really important. And then also having someone in the organization that if there are issues or if there are some concerns with some inequitably things that happen, who do I turn to for those conversations? And how together do we come up with a plan for everyone? Because if it's happening in the boardroom, it's probably happening in a lot of other rooms. And so then how do we set the tone and the culture and the model to do it the right way?
I think, you know, Karen even mentioned it in terms of the showing up comment, how she encourages her mentees to have a seat at the table. Don't stand on the side and be on the sidelines. And so much of what you and your colleagues have been saying so far comes back to physical presence and what you're bringing with you. Have you identified either earlier in your career or with the people you mentor or work closely with, anything that is kind of common maybe in the first 10 to 15 years of one's career that they might not give as much thought to, but given some time, you now see it as something that was holding you back, or people didn't see you as you would like to have been seen among a group?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I do think from the beginning of my career, there was that lack of confidence of making sure that what I had to say was being heard. And instead of making sure I planned it with, I think Nikki said it beautifully, understanding the metrics, the outcomes, and the engagement in those conversations. Instead, I think in the very early part of my career, I was so worried about what they were going to think I was going to say, whether than having confidence of what I was saying, which maybe probably had me stumble a few times. And so talking to other women who I respect so highly and making sure that I was prepared and ready to speak and really felt that my word and what I was saying was going to help to get to the outcome we need to get to, helped with that. And so I do believe some of it's time, watching other women who I respect highly in that role, and then really building relationships with who's sitting around the table before you even go in. I think we can never underestimate the importance of relationships and who you have that is around the table that you can volley to or converse with to make sure that your voice and what you're saying is being heard and supported.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Sue. And then I want to also touch on the likability trap, as it's often referred to, which is people really prioritizing, are you a positive cheerleader? And if so, I'm going to gravitate toward you as a mentor versus perhaps the one who's the biggest expert in the room, but not necessarily the most bubbly. It's a stereotype and a stigma that people have been running into now for generations. Do you have any thoughts on how you personally have overcome this?
I'm not sure I've overcome it in my career because I really have, in growing in what I've done in my role, I think it's really okay to be liked. I don't think it's a bad thing. However, what I do believe is, how are you showing that you have credibility and still likability? So I think they go hand in hand. Our kindness, our compassion, our way of being, with being kind to each other, sometimes may show up as being the Pollyannas or the likabilities. But when you have joyful spirit in what you do every day, along with credibility, that becomes contagious with others. And so when you bring joy into a setting with many different people around the table, how does that get back to the patients and those that we care for and that we serve? And so I think that it's the credibility to get to the outcomes that you need to get to build the metrics, to show up one of our famous sayings that I believe that we talk about all the time is, I show up as I want everyone else to show up. How they show up is how you show up. And so that's really important to me. So if everyone has kindness and a joyful heart, and we're credible, and we have professional opinions, and we look at the outcomes for the patients, I believe strongly that likability turns into confidence.
I love that, Sue. I just think it's such a great reminder. We contain multitudes, and joy, enthusiasm, happiness, being kind, those aren't traits that we should be suppressing or hiding. But we also, our credibility can coexist. It's not either or. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Thank you.
Great. Well, Sue, it's been excellent, wonderful to hear your insights on these questions. I'm going to turn now to your colleague with us, Liz. We're going to talk now about clinical and patient care and its intersection with gender. Hello, Liz.
Hi. Great to be here.
Well, thank you for being with us. So Liz, if a woman is listening right now with us today, and she's currently a practicing clinician who wants to one day ascend to a C-level role, given your experience, what is one distinction between those two realms that you would encourage her to anticipate?
Well, let's just say if she's a physician, as a physician, you can be very successful being expert in your field. Obviously, you need the technical and clinical skills to do the job you've been hired to do. And you clearly need interpersonal skills because you have to work with others, the people that you collaborate with, the people who you refer your patients to, and the team in your office setting or your inpatient setting or your operating room. All those skills are important. But when you're a provider or an individual physician, you really have a lot of control over how things go and what the outcome will be. And I would say if you're used to that and you're happy with that, and you'd like to ascend to a C-suite role, you need to be prepared to realize that you're part of a team of people who've been hired to do a really, really important job to steward an institution, to meet that institution's goals. And the ability for you to be in more autonomous control of an outcome is reduced because you're a team. So of course you need your clinical skills, your technical skills, your competence, but you need to really think hard about how you're going to develop your interpersonal skills because your outcomes will be dependent on the way in which you interact with others. And to take a very, very simple example, let's say in my role, I'm a chief quality officer. So we're working on reducing preventable patient harm, falls with injury. How am I going to get that done? I need to work with the chief nurse, the chief operating officer, chief medical officer, folks who are in charge of the residents, and really develop a coalition and a plan. So certainly I know what the outcome should be, and I may have a roadmap to get there, but a big difference between being a provider and taking care of patients and then working in a C-suite team is really thinking about how to work with your colleagues and collaborate. Some of that's fun and easy, and some of that can be challenging. So I would say the other thing a provider should consider is how they're going to deal with people who you may have conflict with and not necessarily get along as well as you'd like. It just gets sometimes a little bit more rough or more challenging in the C-suite environment, depending upon the C-suite, of course.
Excellent. So they should be ready for their ability to control the outcome of the process is not going to be as autonomous as a C-level leader as it is as an individual contributor or clinician.
Yes, and what I see in younger folks who try to move in this direction is sometimes they're impatient, sometimes they're frustrated, and they can run into trouble. And I coach a lot of people on this, and I mentor as many people as I can, and try to coach them through these transitions in their careers.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Great. And then, Liz, what are some of the most important strategies that you equip your team members with for the moment when they encounter bias or prejudice from a patient, whether that relates to their gender or any other aspect of their identity?
Well, I do a lot of coaching on this as well. And I emphasize that people should be prepared for it. It was there when I was a trainee, and there were times that I wish I was more prepared for it so that I could address it in a more constructive way. And I've been in the field a few decades, and it still's here. Gender bias is here. I'll tell you a story. Recently, a young trainee came into my office, and she had a very, very serious look on her face, and she said, "Liz, I really have some important things to talk about. I'm really upset to share with you that I and others in my training class are experiencing gender bias," as though it was new and I might not know about it. And I thought to myself, oh, maybe I haven't done enough. Maybe I haven't told folks that they should expect this. And she went on to tell me scenarios that were not that different than when I was a trainee. So what I do now is I encourage people to be prepared for it and to have a strategy for dealing with it. And even yesterday, I was talking to some new folks who are coming back to work in this organization after having done some subspecialty training. And I was asking them, how did it go? What about gender bias? And they said, sure, it's there. And I just put myself out there. I introduce myself. I wear the right professional clothing. I don't give the patient or the family, because a lot of it comes from patients and families, I don't give them the opportunity to project onto me who they think I am. I make it clear to them who I am and that I'm here to take care of them. So I thought she was extremely wise, and I would share that with you today. But that is the main message. You cannot wait until a patient or someone else puts on their projection of who you are. You have to tell them who you are.
I love that. And I think in that setting, that makes so much sense with the patient bedside or with their family. But also, I think that that comment really resonates with so many of your colleagues' remarks too, to not give someone the chance to define who you are, to do that yourself. And Liz, you mentioned you've been encountering this for years now, and you had someone who's reporting it and experiencing it for the first time. You've also had the chance to really condition your response when you do encounter bias or prejudice. Is there anything that makes for the unique, what makes your response unique? I guess I'm just curious what that looks like from you. If I were to see you responding to some sort of prejudice that popped up at work, what would that look like from Liz?
Well, let me just say we also have put policies into place, and I think this is something that I would recommend organizations consider, so that if a patient expresses concern about gender, race, ethnicity, religion, that it's not okay in our organization. And we have policies that do not allow patients to switch providers based on those conditions alone, socioeconomic kinds of conditions or characteristics, excuse me. So we do have a language that we suggest to use. And I would say that if someone says, I don't want to have a woman physician, and I'm in the room and I see that happening, what I would do is step up and advance to that patient. Well, this is Dr. So-and-so, this is Dr. Allen, she's a gastroenterologist. What is it about Dr. Allen that you are uncomfortable with? And that puts it on the patient. The patient might say, well, I'm not comfortable having a woman gastroenterologist. And then you acknowledge that and say, well, she is a woman. She's a well-trained gastroenterologist. In this hospital, we have only well-trained gastroenterologists. And she's the doctor who's going to take care of you. We'll make it as comfortable as possible for you. And if that doesn't work, we have ways to escalate. But having a policy actually gives not only the individual physician that empowers them to speak up, but it gives the bystander the opportunity to speak up, and it gives you a place to escalate it to so that it is our policy. So I think that's a very important consideration. And practicing, giving people the opportunity to talk these things through, and not to get mad, to sort of go in with a Kevlar vest and not to get mad. Try to think about it from the patient's perspective and explore it with them. It's not easy, it doesn't always go smoothly, but we do have the policy to back it.
I understand. So policy and then also practice, like you said, and I really appreciate you walking through that encounter. I think conceptually, I understand that that's not something that's intolerable, not something to tolerate from a patient, but hearing the language and the tone from you, I think is just really helpful, Liz. So thanks for doing that. Angela, I'm going to welcome you aboard. Liz, we'll be back with you in a moment. Angela, welcome. Thanks for being here with us today.
Hi, Molly. It's great to be here.
So Angela, we all know here today that building an equitable team is really an ongoing, never-ending effort. It's like you're moving in the direction east. You never get to east. You're always moving in that direction, though. What are one or two of the best and worst things, I would love to hear worst as well if you have those, that a clinical leader can do throughout his or her career to further an equitable team and to make sure a team is constantly growing and evolving and becoming more equitable?
I love everything that I've heard so far. It really kind of talks about what each one of us can bring to the table. And I think that's extremely important when you're talking about your team. So when you look at clinical teams, it really is a group of individuals coming together for the care of a patient. And you're thinking about what does each one of them bring from kind of a technical expertise standpoint, but you're also thinking about how do you make that team function in such a way that you can do your best work. And so when you're looking at bringing together that team, you want people that are filling in those parts that are missing. And I think when you think about it like that, then you're never going to be stuck in just looking at one particular type of person, because none of us have every single quality that we need. We need others to bring that to the table. So in my role as the physician, I'm leading a team, certainly, and I heard earlier it was talked about kind of that control because of your expertise and your knowledge and technical skills. So it's kind of a command and control model. But what I need is I need other people to fill that in. So maybe I need somebody to help me a little bit more with the bedside manner. Maybe I need somebody else who's going to come in and do more as it relates to preparing that particular patient and family for a procedure. Whatever it may be, then I want to build that team with all of those competencies. If I'm truly going to do that, then it's not going to be one type of person. I'm going to have men, I'm going to have women, I'm going to have all different kinds of races and ethnicities if I'm going to have a team that truly is fulfilling all of the skills that I need.
I love that. I think that's so helpful. So assessing your team, what do we have, what's missing, what competencies, skills, qualities, areas of expertise do we need to reinforce and strengthen?
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions that a leader should be asking themselves in that kind of moment when you're assessing a team for needed strengths?
And I think the other thing leaders have to ask themselves is, am I actively looking for something that looks different than I do? So I think many times we become very comfortable with people that are similar to us. And that similarity can be, are we the same specialty? Did we train at the same place? Are we from the same parts of the country? Do we have the same football team that's our favorite? Whatever it may be, there is an opportunity to look for a diversity of thought. I know that when you have the opportunity to have people on your team who see the world differently than you do, who come to it with different experiences, that is only helpful, especially as we look at a very diverse patient population. Even our workforce, it's very diverse. As leaders, we want to mimic that. And the only way we can do that is when we actively seek out to have that blended looking leadership team that looks a lot like our patients and our workforce.
Mm-hmm. And then, I'm going to take it one step further. I have a follow-up question for you on that point, but you know, posing the question to yourself, am I looking for people who might not look like me or be as similar to me? It really relies on you being honest with oneself. And I'm curious if you were working for people who are with us today and who are working with teams where perhaps that question isn't even being posed, or perhaps it's being a bit dodged and leaders aren't really owning that. How would you go about in approaching a senior leader and recommending that perhaps we widen our search, perhaps we go past your alma mater, perhaps we really start to look for some different types of people, traits, characteristics, demographic traits to fill this position? Do you have any tips for how to broach that conversation?
I think just as what was stated earlier, and part of the conversation that Liz had about how systemically they have policies and procedures that say we're not going to tolerate certain types of behavior, and that's part of the answer. The same thing goes with rounding out a team, if you will. So admitting that we need to look different, we want to look different, and we will search out what we are missing. I think that's one way that you can do it, actively seeking out diverse teams. The other part of it is being really honest with yourself as a leader, and also being honest, the organization being honest with themselves to say, what is it that we're missing? Where do we need to look more like our workforce or like our community? Certainly where I live in Houston, this is a very, racially diverse, ethnically diverse city. Every part of the world is represented here. And so we want our teams to look very similar. So we actively need to pursue that, and we need to talk about it. At the end of the day, we always want the best people on our team who are bringing those skills that we need. But if we don't go looking for it, we're definitely not going to find it.
Excellent advice, Angela. So we are actually going to keep this idea in mind as I welcome your colleagues back on screen with us for one final question with everyone. Here we go. Terrific. So this is going to be a rapid fire question as we close. If you can limit your comments to about a minute or less, I want to check in with each of you. And we've gotten such a great overview of so many different realms of what it means to be a female and a leader and working in healthcare from you today. But I also want to get in touch with a bit more of a personal question. And that is, what is most important to you as you set a tone about gender equity on the teams you lead? So I can either go in the same direction we went for our opening remarks, or I can open the floor up, actually, which I would prefer to do so we can go in a different order. But who would like to take that one first?
I'll jump in. So, thank you, Molly, for having me today and all of us in creating a space for us to talk about this important topic. I think what's important for me from a gender equity standpoint, and what I've always done in my career, is been very intentional. I have made a commitment to making sure that women and others are supported within the work environment. And so for all women who may be listening today, I think it's important for you to examine your why and how you can support other women. So being intentional has been what I have really focused on. But also there is this opportunity, and I think it's important for us to state our expectations. We are all leaders, but state our expectations for our team, and what we expect and how we will govern ourselves, how we will listen differently, how we will recruit differently, how we will promote differently. And I think if we make a commitment to that and we measure it and we track it and we talk about it, we will be successful and we will see the change that we expect. But if we take a blind eye to it, we will not. So I'm encouraged just through these conversations, listening to all of these women talk about their experiences and what they're doing to really move the needle. I'm encouraged. So thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Molly, and build off what Nikki just shared. You know, I talked about sponsorship before, and Nikki just talked about being intentional. And I think that that can occur in the moment as well. And so if I'm in a conversation and we're thinking about, well, who could lead X, or which person would be best for this project, you know, really questioning and identifying, saying, well, what about this person? Could we stretch this person? Could we give them that role? Could we give them that project? And, you know, it's interesting because sometimes people will stop and they'll think a little bit and they'll think, well, maybe that's not someone we've necessarily gone to very often for, you know, something big or big stretch assignment. But that's really how you can advocate for other people in the moment, for women, for people of color, anyone that you're thinking about that you think that person's got talent, we need to stretch them and advance them. So I like doing it that way as well. It does make people stop and think sometimes, and it's a great opportunity for people.
I'll jump in. You know, one of the things I really like about Zoom is when you have your team on Zoom, just like we've become a little team this afternoon, is that everyone's in the same size square. And it's hard to talk over one another. So I think Zoom, in a funny way, democratizes or levels the playing field. And when I'm running a meeting on Zoom, I'm very intentional, just like you said, Nikki, intentional about trying to give everybody a chance to talk. And whether it's gender equity, race and equity, any kind of fairness, try to give everyone a chance. So that's one of the things I like about Zoom. And then obviously in one-on-one encounters, the same kind of a thing. You look at that individual in the face, in the eyes, and ask them, do they feel they're being respected? Are they getting what they need? Sort of reinforcing that importance of fairness and equity in our one-on-ones, and making it very personal and making it part of my brand. That's what's important to me.
Well, I could jump next. Thank you. You know, when I was thinking about what I was hearing from Nikki and others, a word that came to mind for me is influence. And how are we actually influencing the change, the cultivating of the culture that we want to create for women of today, tomorrow, and the future to be successful? And I do think it's, you know, how we show up, and, you know, I'm very into how I behave and how I influence and how I mentor, so others can really think about how we can help women or any other equity things that we're looking at advance without feeling that they have to do it in a unkind or a forceful way. So I think the combination of being strength-based coaching, along with bringing out the best in everyone, building relationships with colleagues across the organization, no matter what gender it is, and then really having respect from others that look at we can create, which then becomes very contagious in making sure that we know where we want to go for our future. So I'm very proud of it. And I just want to acknowledge all the colleagues I was able to work with today on this call, because we all learned from each other. So thank you very much.
And I would echo that. Thank you to all the colleagues that are on the phone today, and Molly for your tremendous moderating. I think what I'm most focused on, and Nikki talked about intention. My intention is not to look so much retrospectively, but prospectively, and work with not only early and mid-career women, but also early and mid-career men, and try to enlighten, to raise awareness, because I think a lot of it is unconscious bias. I really do believe there's good in people, and I believe that perhaps it is, you know, at this point I'm starting to give the benefit of the doubt moving forward, and really try to focus on creating a place for women tomorrow, and not necessarily have to live the life that we, or the experiences, repeat the experiences that we may have had, but hopefully create a better place for women tomorrow.
And
I love
tying
what you-
into that, I would say being proactive, on anticipating both the challenges and the opportunities, and then being prepared for those opportunities that might come about, including a constant networking with individuals to understand what are some of the things that you can be doing from a skills development perspective. And then that helps in terms of creating those sponsorship and mentoring opportunities, as well as because people get to know who you are and know that you would like to be doing more than you currently are, and that you have the skill set in terms of doing that.
I love everything that I've heard today from everybody on the panel. And what I would add, based on kind of, we've talked a lot about gender and stereotypes, but stereotypes can also be a positive. The fact that women can have a way of looking at things, empathy, multitasking, or feeling ready for the next role. Sometimes your readiness is that, excuse me, you're there and you're in the room to really own and embrace that and move forward. Every single one of us on this panel has the opportunity to mentor the next generation coming along. And that truly is our duty to do that, and to know that there's enough room for all of us. And in fact, there is more room that's becoming available and that is there. So I'm going to be very focused moving forward on the outcome of ensuring that diversity is truly there.
Wow, I just want to sum up some of the remarks, but Nikki, intentional, state your expectations about equity with the team you're leading, constantly looking for growth opportunities for others was something I heard, even though they might not be seeking those opportunities themselves. Nudge them, say, hey, I think you'd be great at this, be a sponsor. Giving everybody a chance, not just women, but everybody a chance. That is so much about what equity is and is about on teams. Influence, being prospective, so early mid-career women and men, proactive, constantly networking, so many great remarks. I want to thank each of you so much. I think we packed in quite a lot in 60 minutes. I hope our attendees with us today got as much as I personally did from this conversation. It was a privilege to serve as your moderator. I hope that you had fun and enjoyed this, and a chance to take an hour out of your week and connect with some other women and share your experiences and speak candidly about these really important topics. So on behalf of Becker's Healthcare, to our panelists, again, thank you. You were tremendous. And to our attendees, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day to join us for this really important conversation. On behalf of Becker's, we hope you stay safe and healthy and keep up the fight for gender equity in your organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.